What I've tried to do in this book is pass on some of the ideas that I've formulated over 30 years or so of teaching English as a foreign language. One of the things that I wanted to do in this book is explore a few myths about English language teaching. Take the communicative approach, for instance. For the last 20 years or so, teachers all over the world have been trained to use so-called communicative methods, even though it is in many cases quite simply not the best way to get the job done. As a result, we have bilingual teachers using monolingual methodologies, flapping their arms around and refusing to use the students' own language in class, even though their teaching would be much more efficient if they were to break the mould and use what works rather than do what they've been told that they ought to be doing. One area that's been neglected over the years is that of translation as an aid to teaching. There are lots of ways that translation can be used in the classroom, but most teachers associate translation with the grammar translation approach. My point is that whereas you cannot practice the grammar translation method without using translation, you can use translation without practicing the grammar translation method. There are a number of topics I deal with in the book which never seem to figure in regular teacher training. How to teach intimate language, for instance, the language of sex. I mean, sex and relationships are pretty important to most people, and it's an important part of language, and it needs to be learned, and that means it needs to be taught. So I've included a few suggestions about how teachers might do that. Along with blended learning, virtual worlds are one of the most exciting things in language teaching at the moment. Three-dimensional worlds like Second Life simply have so much potential for both learners and teachers. And like blended learning, they're simply too important to ignore. Although each chapter in the book deals quite clearly with one specific issue and is independent of all the other chapters, there are a couple of themes running through the book. One of these is the various roles that language teachers have to play from time to time. Whether the teacher should be a facilitator, mentor, language resource, trainer, or something quite different entirely. The title, Controversies in ELT, comes from a series of articles I wrote for English Teaching Matters, which is a joint publication of a number of English teachers associations in Germany, where my wife and I have our language. Another thing I feel quite strongly about is the idea that we should be teaching some kind of international English. Firstly, there's no such thing. And secondly, teaching a simplified or normalised form of English is really not going to do the students any good. I think that too much emphasis has been placed on the importance of learning a language from a native speaker. Native speakers do not always make the best teachers. Suggestopedia, or super learning as it's sometimes called, is another area of language learning which is often misunderstood, and I've tried to shed some light on that too. Although all the topics I deal with in the book are fairly controversial in one way or another, there are a few chapters where you might say the controversy has not actually sprung up yet, because they're pretty new ideas. One of these is a thing called COLT, or Content-Oriented Language Teaching. It's a fairly simple idea really, but it has far-reaching consequences if you follow it through logically and act on it in the classroom. The same applies to the fractal approach to ELT. This is a concept I developed a few years ago, but has never actually been published in this form before. It looks at some of the parallels between the language of everyday use and the mathematics of fractal geometry. This sounds pretty esoteric, I know, and I dare say it is, but here again I believe there are lessons to be learnt for day-to-day classroom practice. What's the secret to being a good English teacher? Well, you'll have to read the book to find that out, I'm afraid.